Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Rick Harnish. I'm the Executive Director of the High Speed Rail Alliance. For those who don't know the organization, we're a member-supported nonprofit. So we work with people like you all across the country. We envision North America where fast, frequent, and affordable trains help families and communities all across the country prosper in a much cleaner environment. And we help folks understand how great American trains can be, uh, what it's going to take to actually make them a reality here in North America, and what you can do to help persuade your states and the federal government to make it happen. So, passenger rail and city design are totally intertwined. You can't do one right without doing the other right. And so I'm very excited to have Ben Schneider Ben Schneider, who is the author of Unfinished Metropolis, here today to talk about his book. And uh, we can have a little bit more of a discussion. So Ben, I really appreciate you being here. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got to the point where you were interested in this topic and writing this book?
Hey Rick, yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. So I've been covering urban planning for my entire career as a journalist, starting as an intern at City Lab back in 2016 and 17. And ever since, I've been covering transportation, housing, downtown revitalization, and all manner of adjacent topics. And so I wanted to write this book to kind of bring those subjects together to show how they're interrelated. And in particular, I think over the course of my research, I came to appreciate the importance of intercity rail as this force for city building, and how interconnected it is to the success of downtowns in particular, and to the housing conversation of being able to get people from more affordable places to the central cities. So yeah, I've been circling sort of these constellation of issues and increasingly have been drilling down into the rail part of the conversation.
Well, so you said that uh, you started learning more how intercity rail is an important piece of it. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, well,
How are they?
it was really interesting to learn about the history of New York City in particular and the role that the train stations there played. Grand Central and Penn Station, when they were built in their sort of modern iterations in the early 1900s, were these. They basically transformed Midtown Manhattan into what we know it today. These were sort of low-rise tenement neighborhoods that all of a sudden, once they got their train stations, and notably electrified inner city train stations, um, it sparked the massive building boom that produced the sort of Art Deco cityscape of Midtown Manhattan and has fueled New York's economy as a business hub ever since. And so that was a really interesting kind of historical starting place for learning about the importance of how trains, shape urban economies. And then, looking beyond the New York in particular, like you see that pattern repeated over and over in other cities. And then it starts to decline with the decline of passenger railroads in general. But we're starting to see those same forces in some cities once again as passenger rail improves. You're starting to see those same kind of like economic development feedback loops.
You know, I was a little embarrassed. I was in New York this spring, and I'm like, "What's this really cool building here next to Grand Central Station?" And I looked up, and I'm like, "Oh, that's the Chrysler Building." And it's right next to the station. So that you're talking about the Art Deco buildings, both that and the Empire Building, it's Empire State Building, which is next to, quite almost next to Penn Station.
Hmm. And there's been these huge building booms that have gone on even in more recent years. I think there's an underappreciation, even in New York, of the extent to which the proximity to the station really shapes land values and sort of the economic situation there. The Grand Central Station area is the biggest sort of hub of new construction in New York right now. There's the huge new office buildings for JP Morgan. Another big, I think it's Citadel Securities has a huge project that's about to break ground there. And so these are the largest office buildings in North America right now that are getting built basically right on top of Grand Central. And the reason is the proximity to that station and the workforce that has access to.
So, what's the general thesis, or what's the point you're trying to make with the book then?
Yeah.
Well,
So I have it right here. You can observe the cover if it's not totally blurred out. Oh no, it doesn't want to look
I'm-
at it. Well, you get the gist. There's
yes,
a cool Sim City picture on the bottom. Um,
excellent.
the book is called The Unfinished Metropolis: Igniting the City Building Revolution. And the general thesis is that American cities have largely stagnated in their built environment for the last 50 plus years, kind of as the mid-century freeway and urban renewal boom wound down. It was never replaced with a more humane alternative, a new vision for how to build cities that accords with our values today, our needs today, our economy. And so we're stuck living among you know, car infrastructure that's harming us and poisoning us. You know, a huge housing crisis where it's just illegal to build in most places, and that makes housing very expensive. And city centers and downtowns that are just really out of date. And of course, this extends to transportation technology too. You know, while the rest of the world has been investing in high tech automated metro systems and high speed rail, we are still using uh, practically 19th century technology, not exactly, but you know, very out of date um, metro and rail systems in most cities. And so we've even lost sort of, I think, a cultural awareness of what trains and transit can even be like if they're modernized and up to the standards that other countries currently enjoy.
Yeah, and I was very excited to hear, the uh, Chairman Graves of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee talking about how he wants a big highway bill this spring, that it's the most important since 1956, and we've got a lot of highways to build. Like, I'm not sure that's where we are today, but maybe that's true in northern.
Well, there was recent research that came out from the Urban Institute showing that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the last surface transportation bill, um, really only exacerbated uh, it was very poorly spent. Basically, the increase in funding was fully eaten up by increases in inflation, and we didn't really get all that much infrastructure for what we actually spent it on. And this is on top of the knowledge that I think probably most people here are aware of, that when you expand highways, it doesn't solve congestion. It just sort of invites more cars onto the road. So yeah, under the current administration in Congress, it's concerning what they might want to be doing in terms of the federal transportation picture, but we know there are much better ways to be investing that kind of money.
So, how exactly, though, do inner city trains help build stronger cities? What are the factors that make that happen?
Well, I think, you know, people in this room probably are aware of a lot of them, but one thing I homed in on is sort of this more kind of interpersonal, emotional, kind of human level. Just the extent to which really quality intercity trains can shrink the distance, the psychological distance between places, and enable, you know, friendships, business partnerships, creative collaborations, sports rivalries is something I highlight. It just makes it possible to have these connections between cities, between places that just wouldn't be doable if you have to get in a car and battle traffic or get on a plane. It makes it so, you know, people in academic institutions can collaborate, and people in different kind of businesses can make partnerships from, you know, a city like New York to DC, where there is a good connection, or Philadelphia to New York. Um, so I think we kind of underrate that kind of human quality of life dimension of it, and also economic. Like it's hard to calculate even what that ease of access offers, but it's certainly a hugely important part of you know, the success of regions.
So I read through your book as I was heading to the town of Elyria, Ohio, which is my current um, uh, some would call it the poster child of what the issues are, where it's 40 miles from Chicago, from Cleveland. They still have about half of their downtown left.
Mm.
The other half is in parking. They rebuilt the train station, but Norfolk Southern won't let them run the trains there, and the trains don't uh, only stop in the middle of the night. So I was trying to explain to my wife as we were walking around how this would change if you could put together the let's get rid of parking and let's run a lot more trains. Have you tried to describe that in a more succinct way than I can?
Well, it's tricky because it's just not something that I think we are so familiar with as Americans. Virtually every town and even major city downtown has been eviscerated by parking over the last century or so, and so it's hard to even picture kind of what does a thriving place look like where there are buildings on every lot. But the way I envision it is like if you've got a train connecting to the major city, let's say once an hour from Elyria to Cleveland, all of a sudden that becomes a bedroom community, but it also becomes a node of its own kind of economic center of gravity where people from the surrounding region can come there to have dinner, to go to a museum or an art show, to have a business meeting really seamlessly. And then when they arrive, they're on foot. They're walking around the city center. They're maybe patronizing a restaurant or a business. Um, and these sort of, again, it's like these feedback loops. You start to get that foot traffic that starts to make the area more attractive for further development, and you have more people that actually are able to live in that center city area. They're able to commute to downtown Cleveland, which bolsters downtown Cleveland. Um, and you just have these centers of activity where there's just a lot going on, and the ease of access is the key to that, and that's what's missing with our utter lack of rail connections in most of the country.
So I had a friend once who said that State Street, which used to be a great shopping street in Chicago, its decline corresponded with the end of intercity passenger rail
Hmm.
in any meaningful way in 1971. I also noticed that in Cleveland, I grew up in Cleveland and I was there
Hmm.
in 71. Um, do you think that that's a supportable statement that the downtown
Absolutely.
shopping, yeah?
Yeah, because if you look at just the numbers of people that would come through the large downtown rail stations historically, and this is again where like New York is this standout where this is still happening, but it's not happening really in any other city where the intercity stations are getting a ton of traffic. That's hundreds of thousands of people often that were getting injected into a downtown, and they're on their feet. So if they need to shop or they need to go to a restaurant, they want to see some entertainment, it's got to be in that walking radius of the station. And State Street is just across the river from Chicago Union Station. It's and I've been there recently too, and it's had a tough post-pandemic kind of recovery. But I think it's hugely significant if you can get just that volume of train traffic to then help revitalize those kinds of traditional downtown corridors, both in big cities and in smaller cities too.
So, we probably should have talked and I should have given you the map of Elyria, et cetera, but it's triggering, So they have this downtown that's got about half the buildings. They've got a beautiful train station without trains, but they do have a couple Greyhound buses a day. Um, and then they have an almost dead mall on the other side of the interstate.
Mm,
So how does a city like that, now they've got essentially two hurting downtowns because the mall was kind of an attempt to replace the other downtown. How do you think cities deal with that, and how do they use trains to help make that new reality occur?
yeah, well, it's so ironic, isn't it, that you've got the depressed downtown from, 40, 50 years ago, and then the depressed mall from the last 10 or 20 years, where, both of these places, the mall was supposed to kind of save us from the depressed downtowns, and now those malls are depressed too. So it's kind of a sad, like disposable case study in the way that we treat, our urban centers. Malls are a chapter in my book, and it's, I think, a different type of remedy than downtowns and railroads typically uh, demand. But I see these dead malls as very promising places to add some new urban density to more suburban environments, and kind of create a walkable experience of downtowns where they have not previously existed. That real estate is just lying fallow, and there's so much parking. And if you've got a lot of shops there and maybe offices as well that some malls have, you have the starting points for what we talk about as like the 15-minute city, where people could easily go from their homes to shopping and services and businesses on foot. And then, over the long term, maybe that lays the groundwork for creating the demand for better transit. In some cases where rail infrastructure is there, it would be great to connect those kinds of environments by rail. But I think ultimately it's the traditional downtowns that are the places that are going to be the most affected by better rail.
So then how, I guess we connect those two. So just going to the Elyria case where we're saying invest heavily in your downtown and maybe there's a frequent bus connection to the mall,
Hmm.
which is close enough. So they could become a real magnet for development instead of going out into the farmland, which
Yeah, absolutely. And in other countries, what they would do if you have a rail station and another hub is you'd have a tram, a streetcar, better than the streetcars we have here, where it's not in mixed traffic and it has, signal priority and all those good things. But that's a reasonable proposition if you've got uh, a really high quality train station that's getting service, multiple times an hour, and another major node of activity in your city. That's a perfect kind of urban scheme for a kind of tram service. And that's just, it's so unthinkable today because America is so bad at building transit. It costs so much, and we don't really have those kinds of environments that support transit in most places. But I think it's worth having that as sort of a North Star. I don't think it's crazy to suggest in a few decades, if things go right for Illyria, it might make sense to have a tram there connecting, the sort of two nodes of activity that exists.
and if as long as we're talking about trams, let's get it up to Lorraine and that beautiful downtown Lorraine.
Yes, yeah, and I actually have a lot of family in the Cleveland area, and there's so many beautiful historic towns around there that don't get their due too often.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, we couldn't get a hotel except near the dead mall, and I will not stay at a hotel. So we stayed in Lorraine, and of course they had their apology pictures where they've got the beautiful downtown pictures that are served by streetcars.
Hmm.
And if, the same friend who said that downtown started to decline when the train stopped running, calls those apology pictures. Our
Yeah, that's
town
a
was
great
once
point.
great when we had streetcars.
Right, and that's another thing I should have mentioned when I was talking about, building modern trams is that small town America used to have streetcars. It's not a crazy leap. This kind of transit existed and was well used in previous eras, and I think we need to kind of open our minds to think about how we can make use of those kinds of technologies again.
So from what you've learned, what are there any leverage points where you would say, like one leverage point in my mind is parking minimums,
Mm,
and there's a movement to get rid of parking minimums, and Illinois just did a really good job with reducing that a couple of weeks ago.
hmm.
So that's one lever. Do you agree that's a good lever? And are there others where if we really focused on this thing, we could start to make a real difference without, having to lift the whole world?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, parking minimums are huge, and it's really exciting to see what Illinois just did with its transit funding picture and including parking minimums or the elimination of parking minimums as part of that. I think I would add, connecting transit service. I've touched on this, but it's so important, to help get people to the station, especially in like major cities where, uh, there's presumably going to be a lot of traffic in and around the downtown. To have an easy transit connection, this is something you see in places all around the world. Train stations can just multiply they can expand their radius basically of the areas that they're serving by having uh, frequent, easy bus connections, metro rail connections, if possible, to an inner city train station. That's so important. And then, of course, I think the other leverage point I would talk about is urban density. Making it legal to build significant amounts of housing and commercial development right next to and around train stations. It's pretty amazing if you really look at it, how often dense development is just illegal around train stations in America, and that's starting to change. In California, they just passed a big transit-oriented upzoning bill. There's some other efforts like that in cities and in states around the country, but it's still kind of early days to kind of make that connection that if you really want rail and transit to succeed, you've got to put people near there and put activity and life on the street near there. Um, so I think over time, as those kinds of environments grow into themselves, that then creates a built-in demand sort of critical mass for people to then really intuitively understand why the railroad is important to them. It's right next door. It's a key to accessing um, other regions. If it's right there and it's part of your kind of like everyday life, then you can become kind of a natural advocate for making it better.
You talked about people need to start recognizing trends, right? But today, most Americans just see the car dependent. They're not familiar with it, right?
Hmm.
And most Americans don't live in cities right now.
Hmm.
They live in very extended cities, but not in walkable cities. So, what do you think we need to do to help get people to understand that there's a different way where you can walk to go get your ice cream or walk to go to church, etc.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean that's a long journey, and I think that kind of re-legalizing urban density is a huge part of it. But I think I'd also turn the question around and emphasize that there really are a lot of Americans that do live in cities and certainly live in major metro areas. I don't know the exact stats, but a lot of people live in the Northeast, in urban California, and urban Texas, urban up Chicago, Upper Midwest area. These kinds of mega regions we talk about being appropriate for high-speed rail and other kinds of rail. And I feel like those people, those residents, are often not they're overlooked. They're sort of taken for granted as like their needs and wants aren't that important. And I think they're just as important as the needs and wants of people who live in smaller cities and exurbs. So I feel like that's my Pollyannish vision is like, why can't we all just appreciate kind of our respective experiences and our respective needs and wants in the very different and diverse environments we live in as Americans, so that we can support the kinds of transit and rail solutions that are needed for these different kinds of places.
Yeah, and I guess, like Brightline has demonstrated that well, if you start running the trains, people will get on the trains, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Brightline because I think that's an important part of your question. That's a place that didn't have quality intercity rail. The Miami Orlando, it had the once a day Amtrak, but it wasn't nearly like Brightline is today. And I think you see pretty immediately how much uptake that had. Um, People were once it was there as a service that did what it promised. It was a fast, comfortable, very efficient journey. People really flocked to it, and I think that's the effect you see on a smaller scale too with the Borealis service and between the Twin Cities and Chicago, and even it looks like the Mardi Gras service between New Orleans and mobile has been more successful than people anticipated. So much of this, I think, is a matter of just like having the faith to invest in a quality rail service and then watch the people flock to it. If it's actually good, people will use it.
Yeah, and so it's kind of disappointing to me that the folks who were pushing Borealis, including at the States, Borealis, right? Yes, the new train from Chicago to St. Louis, St. Paul. If they'd had more optimism, we could have had 4 trains a day.
Yeah,
And,
yeah, that's a good
uh,
point.
it would have had a very different effect. Anything else that what else should we be thinking of in how these two things tie together?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. High-speed rail, I think, is something that Americans don't really experience. The Acela, we can debate all day about how much that's high-speed rail or not, but there are somewhat different considerations, I think, with high-speed rail that I don't pretend to really know this stuff inside and out, but it's interesting to consider how when you're able to move people really really fast, you might be able to get away with having stations in somewhat more out of the way parts of a metro area, which is kind of what Brightline West is betting on at this point, with its Southern California connection in Rancho Cucamonga. So I think that's an interesting kind of conversation starter for high speed rail advocates and trying to get these initial lines actually started. How much is it worth it to push for these connections that don't go through the most complex, densely packed parts of the city, at least initially, just to get something going? I think California High Speed Rail is increasingly looking at this kind of model as well, just getting something going in the less populous, less complicated regions, and then connecting to other kinds of services. So, I mean, Rick, this is maybe something you've thought about a lot, but I think um, we haven't really touched on kind of the specifics of high-speed rail and what makes it different than other kinds of passenger rail in the U.S. And how we should think about what to push for and what the sort of ideal models are at a time when it's a struggle. Building anything is a struggle.
Yeah. So, well, talking about Brightline West in particular, right? So Brightline West was driven primarily by a guy named Anthony Marnell, who's a
Mm,
big casino owner, and he financed the development of that out of his own money. Um, and he got very close to being able to get it started around in the Obama administration, and didn't quite get there. And so Brightline, he's partnering with Brightline. Brightline took it over, but he knows where his customers are, right? Um, and his customers are in the Central Valley for the most part. His biggest are in the Central Valley and the Inland Empire.
mm,
So his initial proposal for getting something started was don't do the hard part. And the hard part was getting over Cajon Pass down into LA. And just put a really big parking garage next to the expressway because everybody from those two areas funnels across this point at Victorville. And then you've got the slog through the desert, which sometimes is 2 hours and sometimes is 8 hours. You just
hmm
know. So his idea is you put a big parking garage there and you check in your luggage and you get your hotel key at the train station in Victorville. You don't even have to even go to your hotel room if you don't want. Your luggage is there. Um, and, that was a decent way to start, but a lot of folks couldn't quite accept that. So they had to figure out how to get across Cajon Pass, which they did.
hmm
Now that puts you at the point where all of the traffic from the LA basin funnels past that train station before it goes up Cajon Pass. So that makes sense to me as a starter point. And then you don't have to deal with the fact that unfortunately, the railroad right of way was sold to the Caltrans to build an expressway. So how do you get electrified trains to LA? And I think California really needs to focus on doing that, but let's get started.
Hmm.
Like Brightline, Florida, Brightline West is a very unique case. There aren't many places that apply to it. But this other question of like Springfield, Illinois, um, very difficult to get trains into Springfield, a new train line. There's some ways to do it if the state has the desire to flex. But, the high-speed rail engineers would say, well, it needs to be on the other side of the expressway. I'm not sure.
Mm.
I'd rather have it running than have it go out on the outside of town than not have it running and stay firm on it's got to be downtown Springfield.
Yeah,
I
they're
don't,
hard trade-offs.
yeah. So the question is, where do you put the station? So Seville had a really badly located train station. They moved it,
Mm.
and they're right on the edge of town. Um, it's a very interesting question.
Hmm.
And so this case with Elyria, if it's going to be Cleveland to Chicago high-speed rail, the trains don't stop in Elyria.
Mm.
They need to go very far south and come around,
Right.
which means we still need the conventional trains. And we could get that done if the if we would recognize some different way of dealing with the railroads. The right of way is there. Let's make it happen.
Yeah. Well, and that's such a key point to bring up. This is something I get into in my book. I interviewed Martin Oberman, the former STB board chairman, about these conflicts between the freight railroads and Amtrak and other passenger providers. It's a huge challenge that I think is just sort of languishing. There isn't really great resolution at this point, or even on the horizon of like how kind of to systematically fix that right of way issue and the preference issue. It seems like it's kind of getting addressed on a case by case basis, which is necessary, but it's not providing sort of the confidence for passenger rail operators to kind of know how to address these situations. Just sort of like have sort of simple rules and things they need to understand. They have to deal with it on a kind of bespoke manner. So that just seems like a huge challenge to invigorating passenger rail, getting some more consistent uh, ideas about how to make this work from place to place, ensuring that all the freight providers are providing the same kinds of preference to Amtrak and have the same protocols for how to deal with it. That's a missing piece that I think the federal government really needs to step in and help with to get any kind of passenger rail boom started. It's an important piece of the groundwork.
I think that's foundational. So yeah, you're absolutely right as identifying that. The 1971 agreement that created Amtrak, I think, is Amtrak's biggest hurdle. Because you can legislate that somebody has to provide you with the best quality service and the best infrastructure, and um, but we're not going to pay you for it, right? Which is essentially what they said. Uh, that just doesn't work, and we've seen that it doesn't work. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of freight that should be moving by train that's not moving by train because
Mm-hmm.
private industry in this current environment will not invest in the tracks you need to carry all of the freight that we need to carry by train. So you are correct. That's a fundamental problem that needs to be fixed. It's kind of the foundation. And we're wrestling with that here in Chicago, where
Mm-hmm.
the Union Pacific and Metric cannot come to a deal on how much it's going to cost to Metric to run those trains
Mm-hmm.
on 3 routes. So yeah, it's not an easy leverage point, but it's the foundational issue. Or were there any other things like that you came up with in the book that you're like, this
Yeah.
seems to be an
Well, I
unanswered
think
question?
another thing we haven't touched on is rail electrification, just
Yeah.
how crucial that is for running fast and frequent service, and I think disrupting this kind of binary we have in um, the sort of American understanding of railroads, that you've got the high-speed trains and you've got regular old Amtrak trains. Um, and in reality, there's this big middle ground that electrification, I think, really is key to opening up. You can run trains. It's more reasonable to run trains much faster. Like the Northeast Corridor, the regular Northeast regional trains hitting 125 miles per hour on that track. Um, Now the Caltrain train is 25% shorter ride from San Francisco to San Jose, even though it's not going any faster, really. It's just the acceleration time is so diminished by electrification. So there's just these opportunities with electrification to cut down on travel times, increase frequency, and actually move freight more efficiently too. That's an area that the freight companies seem really wary of exploring, but there's a lot of examples from around the world of freight and electrification coexisting very successfully, and in fact, having even much better energy efficiency, moving huge payloads with electricity. So it's a fertile area for advocacy and discussion and research. I think we could gain so much from more widespread electrification of our railroads.
Well, so yeah, and if you know, the railroads will tell you you can't run a double stack train under wire, and then I've seen it in China and I've seen it
Yeah,
in India
plenty of examples.
and in New Jersey.
Right.
Um, but tell me more about this middle ground because I've been very frustrated through my entire career here with this very black and white. You're either talking about fixing Amtrak or you're talking about high-speed rail, and it's just not true. So in
Yeah,
your kind of outsider observation, where did that come from? What do we need to do to fix that perception?
yeah,
Electrification is be a part of it.
yeah. And electrification, I think, is sort of the gold standard of doing this higher speed rail concept, but it can be done even without it, which I think Brightline Florida demonstrates this. The Wolverine service, the Lincoln service, the Empire service. There are Amtrak trains that go upwards of 100 miles per hour using diesel on these very straight rights of way. That when you're hitting those kinds of speeds for a significant amount of time, it's just objectively going to be a much faster trip than driving. So yeah, getting to that 100 mile per hour threshold, whether you're using electricity or diesel, is just such a game changer, I think, in terms of um, the the travel uh, demand calculus. If people are, as we know, I think people look at the amount of time and the amount of money that it will take to get from point A to point B. And if you can really shrink that amount of time on the train, it just instantly becomes a much more competitive mode. So that's I think a really exciting frontier that can happen in a lot more places a lot more quickly than ground up high speed rail, like in California or Brightline West. There's a bunch of corridors that if you can add an extra track, add some more fencing, better crossing gates, you can start hitting those 10 or 20 or 30 mile per hour higher speeds, and just make that a much more competitive trip.
Yes, and so we got founded with the premise that um, the purpose for our founding was back in the early 90s. IDOT was looking at running 10 trains a day at 110, 125 miles an hour between Chicago and St. Louis. And they were projecting that you would be able to get that trip time down to 3.5 hours. And so there's going to be seemingly a contradiction in what I say here. So we were founded with the idea that 3 hours and 30 minutes is not fast enough. Spain started the same distance going through a mountain range at 2 hours and 20 minutes the year we were founded. Um, and that it wasn't going to be practical and there wouldn't be the political support to push it through and make it happen. And now, 30 years later, we're at the point where we've got the demonstration project done, not the final project. and we don't have the political support to move through to the end. And at that time, Valencia to Madrid was it's about the same distance again as Chicago to St. Louis. They were at 3.5 hours at that time. Um, when they got down under two, that's when the ridership really took off.
Mm,
So what I'm trying to understand better, and I wish we could have a real conversation about this, is how do we marry the two? Instead of the
mm,
state of Washington kind of talking about fixing Amtrak cascades, but not really putting effort into it, and doing a little bit of work on Cascadia high-speed rail, but not really making it a priority. How do we blend the two so that there's a long-range plan where you say, today we're going to do this, while we're planning to do this, we can run this service today and dig that tunnel in 10 years, which helps this, right? Have you run into that kind of conversation anywhere?
yeah.
Is it this continue to be this dichotomy?
It's such an important point. I'm really glad you brought it up. And I think the Pacific Northwest example is a really poignant one where it's like they're got this high-speed rail commission. They're talking about, fully grade separated new right-of-way high-speed rail. They're also talking about fixing the existing Cascadia route. Um, which is it? What's the priority? What's going to happen first? In New York State too, there was a similar kind of thing about, how do we do high-speed rail to between New York and Albany and Rochester? And they studied it a lot, and then they're just going to make some little upgrades to the existing track there. Um, and I don't have an answer to this. I think you, in your advocacy, are really important, and all of you folks, watching, to sort of, I think, raise this issue of like, what are we really doing here? What's the end goal? How can we have both of these things at the same time, or how can we be more focused on the more feasible goal, kind of in the interim? But one thing I'll point to is just the emergence more recently of state rail plans. I think is a positive development, and just making those plans better and more comprehensive, more workable. I've looked quite closely at the California state rail plans over the years, and the most recent one I think is a major improvement in terms of looking at the various projects, many of which are going to stretch into the decades, as part of an integrated network, and not just sort of saying we're going to build that one high-speed rail line between San Francisco and LA. It's got to be more comprehensive than that, and it seems like that plan that they have, the latest version, is understands that a little bit better. And I think maybe other states could, and the federal government too, actually could have more of that approach of just integrating high-speed rail and conventional rail from the get-go, thinking about them as a unified system, not these one-off projects.
Absolutely. So you made me so happy when you started talking about the California plan. So can you tell me more about your impressions of that, why it's important, what it does? That's the key thing is what does it do?
Mm-hmm.
And
Well, it calls for frequent. So it reiterates the support for California high-speed rail, the concept that voters approved in 2008, and reiterates Brightline West being part of that vision. Talks about the connection of the high desert corridor between those two systems. So it's really supporting this idea of what they're now calling the Southwest high-speed rail network. But beyond that, I think more significantly, it shows, it points a goal towards electrifying basically all of the state-supported Amtrak routes in the state, and running much more service, and doing the sort of German-style kind of pulse scheduling, so that all of these systems are really easy to transfer and connect in between. And as I'm talking about it, it sounds really, it is, I think, a great vision. The challenge with these kinds of documents is they're so forward looking. There's so much work that needs to be done to actually make it work. It can kind of sound fantastical, but it's a good starting place for just like thinking again about rail as a system, not discrete little projects that don't have anything to do with each other.
but it's not just that they're actually starting to implement it.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know,
Well, tell me more about what's the latest that you've been seeing.
Oh, well, I did, on one end, it's like one of the keys is unified fare from one point of the
Mm,
city to the other.
hmm
Right. So the Capital Corridor is doing a test of tap on, tap off and that's going to be huge for changing Amtrak's service across the country for you taking credit cards. You've already got tap on, tap off on Caltrain.
hmm
If you look at if you compare the Amtrak schedules, especially in the Central Valley, if you compare the schedules today versus 10 years ago, for the most part, they're on the pulse schedule, right?
hmm
So if the train comes at 3:22, it also comes at 5:22 and 7:22, etc. And then they are really working to get the San Joaquins and the Ace commuter rail totally integrated with the high-speed line for when that launches. And just the fact that they now have a framework where it's not really funded very well. I would like to see them start flexing a lot more money off of highways into passenger rail and buses. But at least there's the framework, and all of the agencies have agreed that that's the long-term plan.
hmm
Um, so it is the kind of plan that every state needs, um, including Hawaii, because Hawaii does have transit services. But you're absolutely correct. So I'm glad that you saw that the importance of that.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe one more brief point, and maybe I know there's some Q&A out there too, but California high-speed rail, the developments recently have just been so fascinating to follow. I don't have like a uh, any kind of breaking news insights on this, but between the Trump administration clawback, almost 4 billion in grants, and then the new CEO really looking to make a major pivot in how they're approaching things, getting that extension of the cap and trade funding that's going to provide, I think, at least 15, 20 billion over the next 20 or so years for the project, the biggest by far funding commitment the project has ever gotten. That kind of got buried in the larger conversation around the administration trying to defund it. And now, the CEO's latest statements about this kind of thing, of really engaging private sector partners in the next year to see if there's interest in extending the line beyond the Central Valley into the LA metro area and the San Francisco metro area. Um, it's a tightrope walk that he's pursuing here, but there's just more happening than has been, I think, in a long time. It's really interesting to watch.
All that project is moving so fast.
Hmm
It are moving in much better ways, not as fast as we want. But he was talking. The CEO Chowdhury, Ian
hmm
Chowdhury, was saying, there's some big asks coming in spring session, and so we really need to get behind those because not only they have been groundbreaking, there still are no standards. There's no safety standards for going faster than 90 miles an hour in this country. Um, the 110 projects are out there, the Northeast corridors, they're still done on exception. And there's certainly no standards for building high-speed rail. And just the fact that we've got California high-speed rail there has pushed so many things. Um, and there's a lot more to learn about this spring. We're going to have a bunch on that, but it's a really exciting project that we need to push on.
Yeah. Well, I'll follow your work closely next year. That's exciting.
Well, thank you. Um, so a long time ago, Bill asked the question, um, what do you think about the streetcar in Kansas City? A lot of the streetcar projects didn't work very well, but this one's seeming to work. What do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I do actually. And that I've been to Kansas City. I've ridden that streetcar, and actually, I think it connects perfectly to what I was saying earlier. That streetcar connects the train station to the downtown, and that's a really important connection, kind of a basic last mile connection that so many cities uh, need, and that historically has been like a huge part of streetcar networks what they actually do. So I think that's been a big part of it. It's just the destinations that it serves are important ones, and it really goes through the heart of the city. And it looks like the extension that I think just opened or is about to open um, goes to another huge kind of activity center in that city, the Country Club Plaza shopping district, and there's some hospitals and apartment buildings out there too. It's really hitting the real major nodes of activity in the city. Um, Too often, the streetcars they're way too short and they don't go to the places that people want to go. But in Kansas City, it was pretty short to start with, but it went to major nodes of activity, and now it's a decently long line that connects to yet another major node. So I think those are the basic lessons there, and it's remarkable how few cities followed that template, but it's good that Kansas City figured it out.
Yeah, I have yet to be there. I want to go ride that. I have been
Yeah,
at that, what's the name of it?
Country Club Plaza, the first
Country
shopping
Club
center in
Plaza.
the U.S. Yeah,
Yes, and it shows that
fascinating
you
place.
can do malls right.
Yeah, it's lovely.
It's fantastic. Well, Mark follows up with that. Are you aware of the Tucson streetcar and what do you think of that? Is that working into that mold?
I've not been to Tucson and I don't really know much about it, so I couldn't comment on that.
And then how would you put your book in the category of the abundance debate that Ezra has Klein has started? How would you situate that in that argument or that?
Yeah, well, I think it's very aligned broadly with this notion that there's a lot of ways of doing politics, doing urban development in the U.S. that are hampering our ability to build things like high-speed rail, certainly housing on a significant scale, plenty of other important things that we need to do as a society. I think where my book is sort of used to that and adds to that discourse is just by providing a lot more texture, a lot more detail about how that has played out in the urban environment, and specifically what we have what we're missing out on in cities because of some of these challenges that Ezra Klein has identified, and also adding more texture to the critique itself. I would say, like, I resonate with sort of this issue of the bureaucracy, being an impediment, but there's also a lot of stuff, in terms of um, capitalism and the power structures of the U.S., uh, like racism, also impeding progress in urban development too. So that's a big part of the story that I'm telling as well.
Yes, that's for various reasons. I've started participating with a group that goes to a different ward every month and walks in that ward of the city. So it's going to take 50 months, but
Cool.
um, you can certainly see where redlining made a huge impact, and we've got to get that fixed somehow. It's not quite related, but it's on the news. What do you think does the 50-year mortgage help or hurt in these issues?
Well, I'm not an economist, so I don't really know, but it sounds pretty wild. There not a lot of people are going to be living in their home for 50 years. Um, but I don't know. Housing economics and finance are a very complicated and important part of the American economy, and I do think there's what I like about just the idea of it is that there's, I think, a lot of innovation that could happen in that general world, and the mortgage banking system, the uh, banks, the sort of quasi-federal banks that we have, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and the Treasury itself. There's so many ways that they could be more uh, invested in housing development in various capacities. So I'd love to see more experimentation. Not sure if this is the wisest move, but certainly more financing, more creative funding solutions types of loans for individuals and developers would be welcome.
Excellent. So I want to, I've done my best to answer the questions that are kind of on topic. If anybody out there has one more question, put it in the Q&A. This is your last chance. Um, Jordan, I don't know if we've seen anything that I,
Well, there's one more from Theo that I think would be a
okay,
good way to close this out.
excellent.
It seems that there's widespread agreement on many of the problems we face, for example, dysfunctional city design and the failure to build infrastructure that actually works for people. From your research, where else do you see the most energy and the most promising possibilities for pushing through reforms that can actually begin to shift and transform the status quo?
Mm. Well, I think the streets themselves are the area where we maybe seen the most progress in urban transformation in the last decade or so. There's been um, a huge push, really, if you look at almost every major city, to add a lot of bike lanes, somewhat with bus lanes as well, and then the whole institution of bike share and micromobility has just really, when you think about it, has is just such a huge change. So that's, I think, an exciting place where, you don't need hard infrastructure to transform city streets. It's not like building a high-speed rail line. You can do it overnight with a couple $1,000s. And that's, I think, an important first step to show the general public that like cities can evolve. There are positive changes that can be unlocked through infrastructure, and that people's habits, people's lives can really be changed. There's twice as many people biking around Chicago now than like 5 years ago. It's amazing, and that's sort of an undertold story across almost every major city. So the challenge then is how do you translate that energy, that insight to the harder stuff, the housing and the high speed rail that takes longer and costs a lot more, but when it's done, it has this transformative impact.
Excellent. So thank you for coming. Really appreciate it. What's the name of your book again?
Called The Unfinished Metropolis: Igniting the City Building Revolution. I'm gonna see if I can hold it up again. Let's see if this works. If I get out of the frame. No, it really doesn't like it.
It doesn't like it.
It's been
I'll,
Unfinished
I'll,
censored.
I'll
Metropolis.
unblur briefly so you can see it. I think it's a pretty
There
there
we
we
go.
go.
Oh, well, they can
It
see
Got a
on the
nice
is.
bright
website.
red background.
There we go.
Can't miss it. It's probably not in that many local bookstores, but it's certainly on Amazon and bookshop.org. Yeah, if you appreciated this conversation, hopefully you'd enjoy the book as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining us, Ben. And uh, thank you for this work. And hopefully we can continue to chat and discuss.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, let's
Yeah.
definitely stay in touch.
Excellent. Thanks. Bye.
Take care.